Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel and event for today, How Data Impacts My Life, Social Justice. Welcome. My name is Maria Khan. I will be serving as your moderator today. I'm a recent graduate of the Carnegie Mellon University program for Public Policy and Management, their master's, and I currently work as a data analyst at Advancement Project California. It's a research and advocacy, racial justice and equity nonprofit here, based out of here in Los Angeles. So I'm very excited for the panelists that we have today to talk about a really important topic and something that we're all really excited to share the conversation with everybody joining us today. We're going to start by just telling you a little bit about Data for Good before we hop into introducing our lovely panelists for the day. So about Data for Good. Data for Good is a Southern California-based nonprofit. We like to say that we think globally and act locally. We represent community leaders and organizations striving to use data and technology to do better and give back to the greater community. We work across all different types of sectors, from nonprofits, businesses, governments, academia, and citizens, to improve life in LA, and of course, a ripple effect everywhere else as well through the use of data. Subash D'Souza is our founder. He leverages a network of public and private leaders to help organizations harness the power of data to make more informed and better decisions to benefit society. And today, our webinar series is called How Data Impacts My Life. So this is a webinar series that was born out of the data literacy program sector/pod that we have within our organization. And we were very excited to introduce this, because really this was our kind of call to action, our call to, hey, we are all data geeks, but we want everyone else to also get familiar with this and realize how this can play a role in so many different sectors and so many different parts of our lives. Today's topic is particularly exciting. As you know, it's social justice. And I know this is a huge and massive topic that we're trying to cover in a very short 1 hour lunch. But really today, what we're gonna do is we have an incredible panelists that we're going to try and touch upon a few different areas of starting conversations about how data can play a bigger role in our communities and as a tool in the fight for social justice, where it can help redesign systems where biases occur, reclaim overlooked histories, and really identify any patterns of oppression. So we're going to try and touch on kind of three main topics. We're going to talk a little bit about how data can be used to rebalance power. We're going to talk a little bit about what's the importance of community partnerships when working with data, and all of the different implications that come with that, as well as talk a little bit about what it means for the audience here today to start getting involved and contribute their skills for positive social change via the use of data. So now I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. I'm going to start out by introducing Aaron Horowitz. He is the Chief Data Scientist at ACLU. As the Chief Data Scientist at ACLU, Aaron's primary role is to kind of set the technical direction as well as the vision for his team. And Aaron's team supports litigation, advocacy, and fundraising with research and analytics. So they've worked on a lot of different things, everything from ensuring the census does not have a question about citizenship, to building churn models to try and convince their monthly givers to stick them out with the fight ahead. So we're very excited to tap a little bit into some of those examples I just mentioned and hear about Aaron's work today. Secondly, I want to introduce Louis Bird. He is the founder and chief visionary officer for Goodwin Design. Louis Bird, Goodwin Design is an ingenuity and design consultancy helping organizations stimulate novel solutions through culture, creativity, and technology, and the human experience, all for social good. I think Louis is one of the speakers I'm really excited about, because he really brings together, kind of glues a lot of the different topics we're going to be covering today. He's an engineer and a multifaceted creative who's written on police reform, racial justice, and more. Louis believes that we must never lose sight of the fact that we must take part in the development not only of ourselves, but for all of humanity. Lisa Thee is our last speaker, but definitely not least. Very excited to have her here as well. She is the lead and Data for Good Practice and in Launch Consulting Group. Lisa Thee is a tech industry leader with expertise in child safety. She's passionate about bringing leading edge technology to protect vulnerable populations while helping parents to keep their kids safe in the digital age. She leads artificial intelligence teams to address some of the most pressing issues of human trafficking, child sexual abuse materials, cyberbullying, mental health, and self-harm. So this woman does it all, but she's incredible, and we're really excited to have her join us today as well. I'm going to have the speakers first off hop in and talk a little bit about kind of what the organization does and what it does, particularly with data. I just want to give a little bit of some ground rules for the webinar today. So if you have any questions, we highly encourage questions. We are going to engage with the speakers, of course, first, but then we are leaving at least 10 minutes or hopefully more if we do have the time for questions from the audience. So feel free to use the Q&A poll to go ahead and insert questions there, as well as the chat box. We'll be monitoring both. You'll also see that we have a poll that you all can answer during the session as well. So definitely answer the polls, and we'll show you the results shortly as well. And there'll be a short poll at the very end as well, and we'll be setting up a follow-up survey as well. So lots of different ways to get to know you all more and get you to be a part of the conversation. All right, so let's go ahead and hop into it today. We want to start off by asking the speakers to share a little bit about what you do and how that particularly uses data or data-centric technology in advocating for social justice. So if you can just kind of give us a little introduction about your work and its connection to our topic for today. And we'll start off with Lisa.
Hi, everybody. And I'm sorry in advance. In this new normal we live in, my next door neighbor is having their lawn cared for right now. So if you hear a nice humming sound in the background, that's what it is. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Thee. I lead Launch Consulting's Data for Good practice, where we focus on helping some of the world's most innovative healthcare, technology, and gaming companies to accomplish ambitious goals of improving digital safety, anti-toxicity, applying AI and machine learning for innovation in healthcare, and also upskilling programs for diverse populations. In a former life, I've been a female tech startup founder. I created a company called MinorGuard, focusing in on using artificial intelligence technology to disrupt the online abuse material generation and distribution of children. And I have an upcoming TEDx talk in 2021 on using AI to disrupt human trafficking in the digital age.
Fantastic. And Louis, if you'll follow up and chat a little bit about your work as well.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So first, thanks for having me here today. I really appreciate it. So here's the deal. I like to start with the why, basically. So my why is really simple. It's to build a world where equity is the norm so that people everywhere will always feel relevant. Now, exactly how I do that is, as you mentioned, Maria, I basically, for my company, live at that intersection of technology, creativity, business, the human experience. And basically, my goal is to bring to that intersection inclusive thinking, inclusive design, and how that can be applied to business operations as well as product development and things of that nature. So exactly what I do right now, what I do is, again, I work with companies and I help them really understand how inclusion can help them in their entire ecosystem. Again, from their organizational development to the actual products that they develop. But with that being said, I'm starting to venture and transition into developing proprietary solutions, technology solutions to solve many things that are taking place in society.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. And Aaron, we'll have you follow up.
Yeah, thanks everybody. So I work at the ACLU. It's a 100-year-old nonprofit that's been fighting for civil liberties for a long time. They've only first started to invest in using data and analytics in the past two and a half years when we started this team. And since then, my team works a lot on supporting litigation as it comes out. So you talked a little bit about the census case, but We also unfortunately had to look at family separation data as it was coming out and track the children and the families that were separated and try and understand why we were getting such bad data from ICE every time we asked for it, to sort of even identifying areas for future litigation. So in advance of the 2020 elections, we built a lot of statistical models to try and predict which counties would have the largest disparities in terms of both race-based or political-based differences in terms of who the people were voting for and their candidates, and prepare our lawyers to fight lawsuits where they need to. We also do some advocacy work. For example, we came out with a large marijuana report in 2018 that tried to establish just how much more police use marijuana to arrest Black people in the US, and how bad that is. And hopefully that supported the really large scale decriminalization that we're seeing now across states in the US. So, but we're sort of always working with this data and trying to figure out ways to do good with it.
For sure. Thank you for touching upon just some of those complexities that come with working with data, but we'll dive into a little bit more of that. So we're going to have the poll results that you all were filling out just being released shortly. So we'll see a little bit about kind of where the audience is coming from and hopefully what they want to hear about, but definitely keep asking questions and engaging in the chat as well. We'll go ahead and, oh, here they are now. All right. So I'll just go over them really quick as you're all browsing them as well. Which social justice issue is the most important to you? Racial justice. We're definitely going to be talking about that today. So I'm glad there are people in the audience that are interested as well. Seems like there's also a number of people who have come here today to apply their data skills for social good. So that's a very encouraging sign, and I think what all of our panelists want to hear. And we have a range of different skill sets with data, which is expected and exciting nonetheless, because we need all different types of people in all different types of sectors to be joining the fight. So let's go ahead with that and tap into our first question and first discussion today. So we wanted to start off by talking about, yes, so data and data-centric technologies are powerful tools, right? We have seen, especially I think since, you know, COVID-19 and the pandemic, how much data has taken over our world and are constantly being exposed to it. So I think we can all, in a sense, agree on kind of the power that this tool possesses. But they're definitely, you know, one of the tools in the toolboxes of our panelists today. And so we wanted to start off the conversation by talking a little bit about, well, how does data and technology aid or perhaps enhance or can enhance, you know, the work that you all are trying to do in trying to address the issues of social change and human rights. So it's a big question, but we're going to start it off with that. And either Aaron or Lewis, I think, wanted to hop into this question first. So feel free to start.
Lewis, do you want to start?
Oh, I was going to say, Aaron, you got the legal background going on, man. You always got to go to legal first.
So I think this one is, and I hope I sort of answered some of this in my introduction about some of the work we do, but for the ACLU, at least in the last few years, we've been using data at least to, and I think what it's good for is shining a mirror on the existing inequalities that we have in our society. So whether it's marijuana, where we see quite plainly that police arrest Black people in some of these states 5-10 times more often than they arrest white people, even though we all know that plenty of white people smoke weed and they're not getting arrested for the same offense. So it's a very powerful tool for our external education and saying, how can this be okay? That's the advocacy side of how we use it. And we combine that with stories about people in order to make it real, right? So you don't just say Black people in South Dakota are 10 times more likely to get arrested. You talk about the experience of what it's like for somebody to be arrested in South Dakota for having, you know, a little bit of weed on them, which happens constantly. And I think that's part of what we do. So a lot of it's education. And then a lot of what we do is we provide evidence. So when we are in court for large cases, we need to have an expert who can say, this is what's actually happening. And part of our team's job is to ensure that expert can talk about everything from, like, in the case of the census, how many less people do we expect to respond to the census if you ask a citizenship question versus not? And that's all modeling, and that's all data that we use. Like, we use predictive models to say these people will not respond to the census, and that's sort of how we won that case. So it's just a big part of who we are as an organization now.
So thank you for that, Aaron. Appreciate you leading that off. So for me, for my company, I use technology, data as evidence in many ways to be able to prove a position when working with clients, to help them understand more so the opportunity that exists by whether that, again, is how their organization can be more inclusive, how their product can be enhanced. And I use data to help support that. Now, with that being said, a key thing that I like to position with is, how can I put it? I guess one thing that I like to do is, I'll call it one of my superpowers, if you want to call it that, is being very transparent and letting people know, letting organizations know that data is one aspect of it. The important piece that to me is we got to go beyond the data. So yes, we have data, but then we got to ask the questions, well, how is this data collected? Is there bias in this data? What exists around all these things? So for me, it's important to be able to leverage the tools of data and technology, but at the same time, a thing that I like to do is pose these more deeper or critical questions, and just to validate, is what we're seeing real, or is there more to the story? Again, getting back to Aaron's point about, looking at data for drug possession for different groups of different demographics. To me, that's one aspect. Then the question becomes, well, why is that? So how can we start addressing those aspects of what the data is telling us? So that's just kind of my approach of how data and technology can be used. And with that being said, I do believe that technology gives us the opportunity to solve many problems within our entire society. With that being said, it's just a matter of how we choose to use it. So I'm going to end with that.
Yeah, and I'll add in, building on what you're saying, Louis, I think technology is often a neutral tool, and it's the intentions of the people using the technology that'll slant it one way or the other. One of the places that I use a lot of data in the work that I do and helping my clients in technology companies as well as in healthcare is to help them find the signal from the noise. Right now, we have a lot of information coming at us at all times, and it's often important to make sure that the subject matter experts in any domain have the right decision-making tools to help them focus their attentions in the right areas and in the right moments, because especially as you're dealing with hairy societal issues like human trafficking or online abuse, it's really important to make sure that the people that are currently in need of support and help from law enforcement are getting the prioritization versus people recirculating old content that is still problematic and re-victimizing people, but they probably are in a safer space at that moment. So we use technology to be able to pull out the wisdom from the data and make sure that the people that have the power to intervene and take action have the right information at the right time to be able to focus on their superpowers and not digging through doing a bunch of manual work to try to enable what they need to do to improve outcomes for people. Whether that be content moderators at large tech companies, whether that be law enforcement following up on cases, whether that be healthcare systems that are looking for bias in their data that they're using for training their models. We use these kinds of tools to make sure that they can improve the equity and align with the ethics of what they want to build versus maybe what is some technical debt that was an accident from someone somewhere in the process.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that, Lisa. And I love what you said, like pulling the wisdom out of the data. I think that is just so true. When you work with data, you're bound to see a lot of different stories almost kind of going on. And it's really about, asking the right questions to make sure that what you're pulling out is hopefully the truest story to what is the truth, right? And I think you touched upon such a great topic. We wanted to start off, by trying to be positive, but we do know there's a lot of biases that we can talk about too when it comes to data. And I want to pull on that conversation. I mean, some of our speakers already started touching upon that a little bit, but while we can perhaps say that data and technology can be a neutral tool, we do know that especially algorithms, from many previous studies, we can see that they're not necessarily unbiased. I think that's something that a lot of us can agree on. And so while still kind of recognizing and going back to kind of what Aaron was talking about and how kind of impactful data can be, especially measurement data, when we're looking at kind of what's going on the facts on the ground. And so there's definitely a lot of power plays in a way. I'm curious to hear a little bit more. I think Lisa, you were touching upon it a little bit, but I'd love for you to even provide an example and talk a little bit more about your work and how you kind of view this issue and address some of the inequities that you were talking about within data and technology. I know there's some really neat work that you all do with that. So if you can touch upon that just a little bit more, would love to get the conversation started about that.
Sure. So I think healthcare is a great example of a place where everybody agrees that we don't want you to get worse medical treatment because you happen to come from a different ethnic group than another one. That is absolutely the wrong outcome that no one wants. And so a lot of times it's making sure that you are creating platforms that can accelerate FDA approval for solutions. So it's been really fun to work with our clients at medical research institutions to look at how do we remove some of the barriers from a privacy perspective and all the requirements of HIPAA, as well as being able to look at data from broader sets of populations so that as these models are being trained, we find those red herrings that are giving the wrong outcomes when they're put in clinical practice. So being able to leverage the most current technologies to do those in zero trust environments where people's medical information isn't getting released at a personal level, but we can drive innovation and accelerate better decision support tools so that I get the same amount of care and the same recommendations if I'm in Bangalore that I am in Boston, for example, or I'm getting the same level of recommendations if I'm a woman instead of a man, or all those different variances. And it's incredibly important to do that. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that you have the right incentives in place for people to be able to share data in a safe and secure way, but also have a way for developers to have access to that data and not have to run up millions of dollars of contracts in order to be able to train on it. So those are some of the ideas of things that we're working on to start to remove those barriers so that we can have more diverse developers. We can have developers that maybe have innovation ideas that aren't backed by huge companies because they have a place to go try and drive that innovation. I know as a female founder myself working in child safety, there's easier ways to make a paycheck than that. But because I come from a diverse population and maybe I have a different point of view on the need for the technology, it helped me exit from a successful corporate career into something more in entrepreneurship around data, because I knew that large companies aren't incentivized to go make money on child safety. It's going to have to be entrepreneurs doing that. So I think it's important that we're all looking at that lens of how do we accelerate innovation, especially from diverse populations, because we have a different point of view on why it's important and maybe beyond what the masses are seeing in the investing world.
Yeah, and just following up on that a little bit, you talked a little bit about incentivization and kind of the challenge of that. And I'd love to pose that question to yourself, Lisa, but also to the other panelists as well. I think you particularly, work with probably some of the most sensitive data, right? We're talking about children, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about medical. So it's definitely a very sensitive data space. And you talk about incentivizing people to work around this data that can be really sensitive, and people can be really scared of getting involved. So can, the speakers talk a little bit about the challenges that they faced of getting other organizations and partners kind of on board to say, no, we need to look into this data, and like, yeah, we might not like what we see when we pull this certain data, but let's look into it further, and what does that challenge and those conversations look like?
Boy, Aaron, I bet you have a point of view on this one.
I do have a
Would
point
love
of
to
view,
hear
but,
it.
Naturally, as somebody who works at the ACLU, I come at this from a more adversarial perspective. I think it's part of the job. We sue people. Like that's what our organization does. So we're always sort of looking for like bad uses of algorithms. And I will be honest that we're probably not always looking for good, because if the algorithms are good, we'll probably like leave you be. But we're always looking for data, and it's always very hard to find, right? I mean, as an organization like ours, I'm asking government actors to give me information about how things operate, and those people usually don't want to give me information. So I get it either by a lot of advocacy. So that could be like people on the ground trying to convince different legislatures to push bills that would make data more transparent. We do a fair amount of web scraping. So looking at open portal websites where it's not actually designed to give us data, we find ways to get it. But I think fundamentally, the reason that I struggle with this framing is we're sort of always looking for the data. The problem is it's usually hard to find.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead, Louis.
So yeah, I was gonna speak on the topic from a similar but slightly different perspective. So as a entrepreneur, somebody that's developing technology, again, one of my flagship products that I'm trying to get fully built is a platform called Awari, where basically analyzing company records, looking for hidden bias that may exist within the organization. Now, with that being said, as I've been pitching it, trying to onboard potential clients and things of that nature, as well as talking to investors, some of the clients that I talked to, one guy, a CEO at a company, he basically told me that his ignorance was bliss. Not knowing the information actually made more sense. I've also had conversations with lawyers who are speaking on it from the legal standpoint, how that's, if certain information was to get out, it can lead to class actions and stuff like that. My perspective is, well, if you guys are already doing crappy things to people, it's better to be proactive and understand what's going on beforehand versus being reactive. Now, with that being said, one of the things that I believe wholeheartedly is that at the end of the day, how can I put it? If we're building autonomous fleets of cars, we have people, private companies are building spaceships now. Technology is in a place where, anything that we basically can imagine, a 14-year-old kid can build an AI chat box in their room at this point. What I'm getting at is that the technology piece is actually relatively easy. I believe that most people do not want to face the hard stuff. It's too complicated. It's too scary for people to say, yo, why is it that, there's certain people in populations who are just underserved, under-resourced, and there's others that are not. Now, I have a perspective on why that is. Ultimately, everything, especially in a Western society, kind of goes back to a bottom line, somebody's dollar. There's always somebody's profiting from something to the, disparity of somebody else. So with that being said, my belief is that, if we're going to start addressing things like this, we want to talk about the data, we want to talk about it, technology, we have to kind of get outside of the ones and the zeros of the algorithm and talk about, well, what are we actually doing as people? And that's just kind of, that's where I'm kind of like drawing a line in the sand. It's like, we have to start doing things differently. We have to innovate outside of technology and start innovating as humans, if that makes sense.
The
Without
will
trying to
to
sound
act
extra
is-
new age.
No, you don't. It's the will to act, Louis. It's
Yeah.
biggest challenges in technology companies, especially people that are trying to break bias and drive societal change and improve our human condition through technology versus erode it, is ambivalence. It's people going, well, you know, this is always the way we did it, or, oh, well, you know, there aren't any laws that make us do this, or things like that or it's HR's problem. Oh wait, no, that's IT's problem. Oh wait, no, that's the product manager's problem. Everybody plays hot potato and then nobody owns it. So I think it's really important we have these kinds of conversations, because these are going to be the groundswells that finally get some of our government bodies to get involved in these kinds of things, and put a line in the sand that says, no, like, this is a bare minimum standard and we're all going to agree to it. And I think that actually helps technology companies, because it's a really challenging competitive landscape when regulation doesn't support doing the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Go ahead. Sorry, I was going to just say, before we on from this conversation, I wanted to make sure, Louis, you also talk a little bit about the work that you do with the law enforcement training. I think sometimes, you know, we talk about how complicated these topics are and all of that, but, you know, I also want to make sure we're teasing out examples to envision where it can be kind of work for social good. And I think you have a really great example of that that I want you to chat about a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So basically, understanding what's been going on, you know, this past year, it was kind of like the last draw, right? You know, is we seen George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. I mean, so many names. But as a Black man, I've been seeing this for a long time, since pretty much my entire life. You know, growing up in the Midwest, depending on where you're at, it can be really. We're just as bad as many places down south, depending on where you're at. So with that being said, my perspective is, you know, I've been doing a ton of research. I'm actually collaborating with some guys out of San Diego, to where we're trying to create a virtual training, immersive technology tool that's very much focused on trying to train in empathy, but starting earlier for students who want to get into law enforcement. Now, with that being said, we understand that from a technology standpoint, it's going to be difficult, because we're talking about neuroplasticity in people's brains and trying to rewire it and all kind of crazy things going on. That being said, I do see that there's an opportunity to leverage the technology that exists to start changing and rewiring some things, but it's going to, again, kind of come back to people and having that willingness to do it. So with that being said, the opportunity I see is massive in terms of where we're at, in terms of technology, the data space, again, AI or artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, all that information is really opening up insights. So from a tangible standpoint, you know, I started doing a lot of research and seeing who's out there in the space that's trying to do kind of this empathy training. And again, one of the things that I've recognized is that what they're doing is great, but they're kind of falling short, because, you know, they're addressing one aspect and not, again, recognizing how things like race falls right into it. You know, if you want to talk about, you know, mental health patients, are the number one deaths when it comes to police involvement. Well, then when we start looking at the fact that from a race standpoint, a lot of mental health patients who so happen to be Black, they're just underserved. They don't get the same type of prescription medicine. And then that ties into it. So then we start looking at the numbers, the data, and we starting to see, okay, what's going on here? Again, my perspective is it goes deeper. We got to start addressing the real challenges as humanity, as a nation, particularly here in the United States, and really look at some of the ugliness that exists, but not in a way of like we want to turn our back. It's like we want to face it head on. And I kind of believe that that's something that we just don't do well in the United States. Arguably, the world is, you know, we're quick to solve symptoms, but not the actual cancer that's killing us, you know? So I'm just going to stop there because my man Aaron has something very important to say.
No, I like everything you've said. I'm trying to even remember the first bit when you talked about the fairness, about how nobody wants to look at what's actually going on when these algorithms are in use. Even in the government, one of the things that we face is the government procures algorithms just like companies do. One of the algorithms that we're fighting right now is pretrial risk assessments. They're like, they basically are algorithms that are used when people get arrested, and then they decide whether or not to put somebody in jail while they're awaiting trial. And we have been pushing the government to put legislation in that actually says, okay, what does it mean for you to be fair when you are using these algorithms? And they tend to not want to do it. They want to put that burden of making an algorithm fair on the developers of the algorithm, even though it's really a policy choice. It's like, what do I think fair is, and how do I make that happen? So,
and why are developers uniquely qualified to determine fairness? I went to engineering school. They didn't teach me ethics.
And yet that's the expectation that everyone who's building algorithms anywhere has. It's like, you're the one who has to decide if this algorithm is fair, which I just think is pretty bonkers.
Yeah. And, touching upon that piece of the government, I think, we talk about social justice, and definitely a lever for power, a lever for change is the government. And seeing as we just witnessed a historic election just a few weeks ago, we definitely want to pivot the conversation a little bit, as we already are, into talking about that. We'd like to see, of course, that data and technology are not being used to oppress communities, right? But of course, this is something that sometimes happens, right? Recently, there was a release in the news where we were hearing about the US military using applications to spy on some 95 million Muslim users. As a Muslim myself, I found this very concerning, but also found it really interesting to start talking about, what role kind of does the government, do you all kind of believe governmental bodies need to kind of take, and where does, the reliance, in a sense, we talked a lot about accountability and incentiveness in this conversation today too, and where does kind of the reliance and responsibility lie as well when we talk about transparency and ethics? Lisa, you brought up something really good, and you're like, well, why the developers, right? Like, how did this happen that all of a sudden they're kind of responsible, in a sense, for ethics-centric, data and technology? So yeah, I feel like I just threw 5 questions at once, but it's a big topic. I know you all have a lot to talk about it, so dive into any one of my 5 questions.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I just want to, I like to touch on that as an engineer as well. Here's my perspective. I believe that it's everyone's responsibility. So I do believe that there should be regulation set out, by a company, the government, things of that nature. At the same time, I kind of point back myself, because I remember being in engineering school. I went to the University of Missouri. There was literally less than a handful of Black people that was in the engineering building, right? And I remember all the biases that just kind of took place as a student. And so I understand and I recognize that even when we're looking at developers, right? I personally believe that there is responsibility on the developers. It's not as easy as, okay, you develop it. When do we draw the line of being like, okay, if I'm receiving a data set, who is going to be the person that's going to validate that data set, or at least ask the questions like, wait, we're typing in, we're training this model, and, we put in Black people images and a picture of a gorilla pops up. Whoa, something's wrong there. And that starts at the beginning of the process. But that's one of those things is where, it's going to become one of those things where you have to be intentional. You have to have, again, getting back kind of to the topic around everything. This is why it's important to have diverse representation at all aspects of the ecosystem, because that can help bring a different perspective to the table. Just posing simple questions like, why is all our data set coming from Western society? Why is it all coming from people that make 6 figures or more, So my personal belief is that it's everybody's responsibility. I do put onus back on the development team, the product managers, And that's part of what I talk about. It's like, you have to be the ones also to pose these questions, or if you don't understand, be willing to hire somebody to come in that can be the ones to say, yo, let us think about this in a different way, or have we considered these things? So it's everybody's responsibility. Government's definitely a part of it. The developers are part of it. The companies are part of it. Everybody has to, if we want to see the change, everybody has to be part of that solution.
So I'd like to build on what you said, Louis. My point of view, yes, everybody needs to be part of the solution. I think a lot of times, though, people that are in those product manager roles, maybe in different life stages, they may be coming from homogeneous schools, especially at the top companies that are hiring a certain talent pool. And I know that there's a lot of energy to try to get more diverse representation in those rooms, but today we're not there. And so I'd like to encourage anybody listening who might have influence on product design or development. Coursera has data science ethics courses that you can take for free. I just got my credential from University of Michigan this year. It's not too cumbersome. And it's a really great way to make sure that you're rounding and looking at things from a different point of view. I think secondly, government is really behind in looking at this problem set. You know, when we defined the Communication Decency Act 230 back in the mid 90s, I don't think anybody could have envisioned the socially connected world that we live in today. And just like automobiles, early in the process, I'm sure nobody had thought about road signs and seatbelts, but eventually you have enough traffic and you have enough crashes that you have to start regulating mitigating risk to the users of technology. And I think at this 20-year inflection point, we're at that place where we're a bit overdue for making sure that there are people in our government that are thinking broadly about these ethical implications and policy implications and helping to set the landscape for these for-profit companies of what they can and can't do. There's not very many industries that are unregulated anymore. And I think tech needs a little bit of guidance, especially when they have more influence and power than most governments these days.
Yeah, I would echo both Lisa and Louis on this. I feel like the role of government is to act as, I don't know, bumpers, if you will. Like there's some boundaries that they need to set, and organizations can do more, including by having staff who are diverse, who can spot these types of challenges in the algorithms as they're getting built or in the data as they are getting built. But the government has a responsibility to make sure that for the companies that don't do that, that there is some safeguards. And there are existing laws that we can and do use to fight algorithms, but they're only in limited spaces. So for example, the EOC, so employment law, does have a 4/5 rule that effectively says like you have to basically have non-discriminatory hiring, and algorithms that exist in that space can be regulated under that existing law. Similarly, for housing laws, we have as well. It's not as if the places where these algorithms are used are necessarily not already regulated and we can't use those existing algorithms, but we may need more than exists right now to make sure that these things actually help people instead of harming people.
Yeah.
I'd like to see things like, you know, the EPA, if you don't follow the rules, there's some fines, there's some consequences. I think, you know, having to rely on a group of lawyers to want to take a case is a difficult way to ensure equity and fairness to people.
Yeah.
It has to be pretty out of control for a pretty long time for a whole heck of a lot of people before anybody digs into it. If I have if I'm doing something illegally with chemicals on my property and I'm creating an environmental hazard, I'm pretty sure they'll show up pretty fast and there'll start to be some consequences pretty quickly. It doesn't have to be this horrible, expansive problem before somebody addresses it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the harm that comes from algorithms is small, but it has an aggregate large effect. So it's one of the things that we have to do is find people to sue on behalf of. But if lots of people have had a very small impact from one algorithm, it's hard for us to make an effective claim versus one really bad thing that happened. that didn't come from an algorithm, which we can do something about. So regulation can help us find ways to deal with that effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. To, Lisa's point, for sure. It's almost like the system that we currently operate off of when it comes to data and ethics is like when it gets really bad, right? And that's kind of when we start trying to address kind of what's going on. I also want to just emphasize for, the audience that's listening today, just kind of how real some of these scenarios are. The example that Lewis was giving in terms of the algorithm where you put in a picture of a Black person, you'll have a gorilla ship, like that was a real algorithm a real organization was using. And, luckily there was research that was done that was able to kind of catch the racial biases within their algorithms. And luckily we have Aaron, who I feel like has given a few warning signs in this panel saying, if you have a bad algorithm, I'm coming for you. But no, I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that these are definitely real issues happening on a daily basis. And while data sometimes can be this mysterious world of like, we can't see it, it's something where contributing to every single day and seeing it more and more. There's one more question I wanted to ask before we open it up to the audience, but I'm going to hold off on it until the end of the session today, because it seems like we have a couple of really great Q&A questions from the audience. I want to make sure we get to them and have them also engage in the conversation today. So feel free to keep sending questions in the Q&A little box if you see it, as well as in the chat. We are moderating it. But I want to start off with one of the questions that we received, which is when we're looking at providing training, like implicit bias training or identifying data or algorithm bias, what should we kind of be focused on? So I think this is a good question because, implicit bias training, especially, I think recently we've heard that a lot, right? And we've heard of a lot of companies trying to do some of that. But there's so many different aspects that can go into it. So I'm curious if one of you or one or more of you can maybe answer a little bit about what should kind of be the focus on when you do that. Yeah, I had a feeling Lewis might have something to say about it.
Stick my little hand up. Yeah, this is definitely in the space. I'm working on this right now. So I believe that what needs to take place is first recognizing the data and how so much data is incomplete, right? That to me is important because the reality is that there's a lot of companies out here who are addressing things like in some aspect of bias mitigation, and they're looking at the data that exists, but the reality is that most data out here simply currently still just amplifies, reflects, and just upholds the status quo of how things have been. And it becomes one of those questions because even as somebody that's developing the technology, I'm looking at data sets. But again, back to an earlier point that I made, you have to have some level of saying, okay, where is this data coming from? How is it incomplete? In fact, I think it was either this year or maybe earlier last year or late last year, Amazon was using for their recruitment. I don't know if you all heard about it, but they were using an AI for their recruitment process, and it was highly just discriminating against people who were not white males. And why was that happening? Because Amazon was feeding the data that they already use internally. And if your company is 85% white males, what's going to happen? These machines are very intelligent machines. The reality is that they're just like kids. I got a 5 and a 3-year-old. They're just like kids. What you teach them, they're very intelligent, but they're going to start adapting things on their own, and they kind of reiterate it. So with that being said, I believe the first thing that we need to start off with is recognizing how incomplete data is. When we start to really understand that, then we can start looking at, okay, when it comes to collecting data, how can we get the largest pool possible from the most diverse groups? Now, it's going to be a tall order, but that's something that I'm working on personally. Even as I'm pitching investors right now, I'm telling them that my first step is to build out better, not perfect, but better data set modules. And that's going to require me to be able to go out and do the research to be able to collect a more complete set of data, so we can have a better product in the end. So long-winded way of saying that the first place I think we need to start is more of a human place and understanding the limitations of what data exists and how can we close those gaps or fill those gaps with new data sets or new ideas of data.
Yeah, I'll build on that a little bit, Louis. When we were working on identifying facial recognition algorithms to help with recovering human trafficking victims, specifically children, one of the challenges we came in was most of the publicly available training data for facial recognition is on adult white men. And the majority of human trafficking victims are teenage, female, diverse people. And thus the algorithms just didn't work all that effectively. And when you're at a 70% accuracy level, you're not at a level to deploy a solution that law enforcement could effectively use. It'll be too frustrating with too many false positives or negatives. So what we did was we looked at using more modern techniques, more nearest neighbor search type of techniques versus using the classic training data in order to get out of our own way in some of the places where the algorithm was really failing. Things like lighting and makeup and bangs. Bangs really messed it up. Just things that you didn't see in the regular training data set. So I think there's a white paper that we have on how we went through that process that's attached to the notes that will be sent out after this. If you want to look at that more, it came out of Intel. But there, I think it's looking at what data is available, what problem are you trying to solve, and then correlating where those blind spots will likely be in that data, I think is really important.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to ground the conversation a little bit. The next audience question comes from Anita Sengupta, and I think it's really helpful because right now, we're talking a little bit on kind of a high level. I mean, you're all incredible leaders in your field, but if we can talk a little about, what actionable steps can anyone, take in their office places, in their classrooms, to provide kind of a grassroots way of changing things. And what about, she also asks, what about leveraging our consumer purchasing power? So if one of you can take that.
Oh, Anita, I've been waiting for somebody to ask me this question for like a year. So I'm sorry, I'm going to be overzealous in responding to it. Wonderful question, Anita. I think at the end of the day, what you need to recognize is the people that are going to be creating the most innovation in data science and AI are going to be large companies that are collecting huge amounts of data. So I think they're all household names we're all pretty familiar with. They tend to be in the cloud providers, the cell phone manufacturers, the telcos, the media companies, the places where they are harvesting information about us in order to be able to be more effective advertisers, because that's their business model. I think it's really, really important that you think about what are your values, and are those companies reflecting your values in the choices they're making in product design? And if they're not, recognizing that if a product is free, you're the product. You're what they're selling, and you don't have to opt in. And you can also be a vocal advocate for yourself as a consumer of expecting more from them. As a parent, I have a little bit different perspective on user-generated content in social media and in gaming than I did probably when I was 20. I would love to see this younger generation that is so much more socially minded than I think prior generations were in a lot of instances, asserting themselves with some of these companies in terms of expectations. Because I think the companies, when they recognize a hit to their bottom line, a lack of engagement on their platforms, are more than happy to make the changes that they need to make in order to gain their users back. But if everybody just keeps using it and complains about it on like Twitter feeds, there's no impact to their bottom line. There's no incentive to change.
Yeah, and I want to start wrapping up, but there's one last audience question that I want to get to, and I'm actually really curious to hear Aaron's perspective on this, because I imagine this is something that you hear a lot about in the work that you do. Stephen Kwok, I believe is how you pronounce it, is asking, how can the government regulate misinformation on social media while preserving freedom of speech. And again, a topic that we probably hear about a little bit, but would love to hear your perspective on it, Aaron.
I was hoping not to have to answer this one because it's a hard question. Mostly because my personal opinions probably differ from where my organization's stance is, and also because it's a really hard problem, and I don't want to deny that. So I think that freedom of speech is an important part of America, and certainly why I joined the organization I did, right? We've defended Nazis, and I'm a Jew, right? Like, I believe that people should be able to say things, and the reason that we can have protests in this country without violence, although to be frank, the police are not living up to their side of the bargain on this, is because freedom of speech is a powerful thing that we believe in. So I'm sort of against preventing people from saying what they want on these social platforms, and I think we sort of have to be. But that said, there's nothing stopping these platforms, and they're finally starting to do it, to at least make people aware of what the misinformation that's actually getting spread on those platforms. And they do have a responsibility to not amplify that misinformation, which they're not doing very well right now, right? Like, the algorithms that they've created do not prevent that, and I think they could be doing more. I think the government's role in that is to try and at least regulate how much that misinformation is amplified, not necessarily regulate whether it's allowed to exist on the platform. I think that's the role that a government can have that's fair in this situation. But I'm not a lawyer, and I'm sure some free speech lawyer at the ACLU would dislike whatever I just said.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that complex and hard question, which seems like a lot of our questions today. I want to wrap up the conversation and the event for today. I know a lot of people in the audience were talking about, how they can get involved. Our wonderful program manager, Katie, has put together an extensive list of resources that we'll be sharing with everybody who attended today. So we'll definitely be sharing some resources with y'all on kind of how to get involved and continue the conversation. I also want to take a second to thank all of the panelists here today. Thank you all so much for being a part of the conversation today. Continue the conversation outside in your own lives. You're also seeing a little poll that we have just to let us know a little bit about kind of how we did. So fill that out as we're wrapping up. And with that being said, I'm going to ask just one final question. If you all can do me a favor and answer it super short and quick, but I believe in you all. And the question, really is, we want to leave the audience maybe, in a little bit of hope. So we want to ask, what advice do you have for data professionals who are interested in either contributing their skills, working with advocacy groups, or ensuring that the data that they're working on doesn't create further inequity? So what can kind of that small individual involved in data do?
I'll just make it real simple. I think it's very important for everyone to really learn the value and the importance of cultural competency, because that will help bridge a lot of gaps, regardless of just cultures and race, but just everything. So cultural competency, learn as much as you can about that.
I encourage seeing more diverse populations in STEM education as well as in entrepreneurship. I think we have a underrepresentation that creates a lot of blind spots for people that are in positions to make small decisions that have large outcomes later that maybe they don't anticipate. So I'm discoverable on LinkedIn. I'm a huge proponent of women in entrepreneurship and diverse populations. If I can be of any support, please let me know. Oh, and I love the Center for Humane Technology. It's another great place to influence product managers and other things with education material.
Yeah, I would say, besides looking to sort of change the staff dynamics where you work, to the point that a lot of this is not regulated, voices on the inside of companies can have really big impacts on what those companies decide to do. And so if you want to make sure that you're working with data fairly, that you're aware of the blind spots that exist in the data you're collecting, that is something that you could do at whatever company that you are working with, especially if you're working with consumer data, which many people are. So that's something to look at, something to pay attention to. To Lewis's point earlier, if you just decide to sort of use the ignorance is bliss concept, you'll never really get better at making things fair that you're using.
The more data you put in these models, the better they get. Go seek out more diverse data sets. I mean, just because you have internal data sets that might get you the first mile, looking at transfer learning and bringing in different points of view into that model can be really powerful as well.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing. Thank you all so much for your time today. You know, social justice is something that I think it's not a tool and it's not a system. It's really a movement. So while all of this, there's definitely complex issues that we're trying to solve, I think it's really powerful to have events like these and have panelists like yourselves to engage in this type of conversation, because yeah, it is hard and these are issues that are hard to tackle, but I really think the movement happens when we continue having these conversations. So I hope the audience will join us again for our upcoming events. We will have some more events on the How Data Impacts My Life series upcoming in January and February of the new year. Can everyone believe it? We're getting to the end of 2020.
Already.
Right? So we're excited about that. Please join us again, and definitely be on the lookout for the resources that we'll be sharing as well. So yeah, that is all for us now. Thank you all so much once again, and thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the entire Data for Good team. There's a lot of people working behind the scenes to put this together, so I appreciate everyone doing that work. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.